Boom.
And Bordeaux.
This is Reboot Biblical Perspective coming to you live from the Trinidad Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. The one and most unique podcast where we approach the New Testament, identifying some of the misguided westernized perspectives, giving context to the rediscovered spiritual dynamics of the scriptures by the lens of Rabbi Yeshua and his apostles, with informed commentary on their perspective of spiritual physics, verified by our pragmatic and experimental research carried out under the ON KPTV International Institute of Pneumatology. I am your host, Zainul Fuego, the Christ pneumatologist, and co-hosting with me, of course, is the lovely...
I am Lily Ketura, your Christ mentor. I am absolutely delighted to be here together with Zane so that we can share with you all on a very exciting topic. Today we're going to share and discuss with you some of the rediscovered truths that we have found in the Holy Bible, which is like the manual for living. In this particular episode, those who will benefit will be of a few categories, which I will highlight now. So feel free, if you identify with any one of these, to tune in. This is definitely going to be a game changer for you. So if you are in a leadership position, this is for all our counselors, therapists, coaches, pastors, and I haven't named all, but you know yourself. This also fits the category of those who are facing an identity crisis, a midlife crisis, or a quarter life crisis. And last but not least, those who are feeling unfulfilled with the course or the direction of their lives. So as we all know, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and many people, millions of people are facing personal crisis as well as identity crisis. Something like this has no respect of one's age, because even after existing here on earth for a long time, as a result of the pandemic especially, some people find themselves questioning their significance, and some are even dealing with internal conflicts that are questioning, where they question their value, their life, and who they really are. But before we go on, I'm just going to share a fact with you. I mentioned the term identity crisis. I'm just going to share where it first came from. So this term came from a developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson. And for those who are familiar with it, this identity crisis can be very, very stressful for persons dealing with it. From a pneumatological and biblical perspective, we have found the solutions. So if you stay tuned, by the end of this podcast, you will have a very clear understanding of why you may be experiencing the identity crisis. You will be able to identify the hidden beliefs that have kept you trapped in it. And you'll also gain a basic understanding of who you are and what you really mean to this world. So, Zane, I'm going to throw the question back out to you before we continue. So we touched on a topic last week that is very much intertwined with what we're about to discuss here. We talked about the word. So for those who are listening, why don't you give us a recap of what we covered so that we can bring some context to what we're about to dive into?
Yeah, so last week in particular, we started off by taking a look at John chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. And the first thing that we identified was, what is the word? And just to recapitulate what we covered last week, we identified that the word was simply God's thought of himself that was actually breathed into dust. And therefore, that the word God's thought became flesh, which is also what we refer to as the breath of life, with what the Genesis narrative refers to as the breath of life, as well as the spirit, right? Breath, spirit, mind, heart, all of these things are pretty much parallels in scripture. So when we look at the word in particular, we're looking at God's thought about himself that is actually breathed into dust. The word made flesh.
Wow. All right. That's so good. I love how you recap that. So then you mentioned something a while ago that I'm sure probably caught the attention of those who weren't here last week to hear what we shared. You said that we went into the Genesis narrative.
Yeah.
What really happened in the Genesis narrative with the breath of life?
No, this is a very good, that question that you're asking there is an excellent question. And I think it is an excellent question because of this in particular, what I'm about to say here has been pretty much lost for some time, over possibly centuries. the modern day world in particular has pretty much they've begun to somewhat lose a sense of value for the Bible or for scriptures. And what we are about to talk about here is definitely very much applicable. It's just not explained or emphasized, or this is not really the focus in particular. And because of that, people actually have a little quandary with regards to how the Bible really applies to modern day life.
Yeah.
So what happened in the garden in particular was well, I shouldn't say simple, but it is simple.
It's simple once you get it.
Right. So overall, I mean, we don't need to sit down and try to read the Genesis narrative all over again. But what basically took place is that the same man that was created in the garden, he was actually God's thought about himself, breathed into dust, and therefore the image and likeness of Elohim or Yahweh Elohim himself. Right? And what really took place is that some deception took place in the garden, where instead of actually, now let me just actually say this, because the man in the garden was actually the image and likeness of God, who is identified in the narrative as Yahweh Elohim. The names, there's something very particular about names in the Bible that most westernized believers may overlook, and that is that we, for example, in the westernized community, in our Greco-Roman perspective and Greco-Roman mindset, we approach names from the perspective of labels. So, for example, someone is named this and they actually use the name as a label, like to be able to identify them amongst other things or other people.
Right, yeah, we do.
And it is very important to note, because if this is not understood, then you may not even understand the gravity of what took place in the garden narrative. Is that names in the scriptures from the ancient Hebrew perspective are not just labels. Names in particular indicate not only it's not only used as a label, yes, but it actually is a lot more than that. It indicates essence, and it also identifies function.
Okay.
Which means if when I say function, it literally identifies how this being functions. So if man was the image and likeness of Yahweh Elohim, then the name Yahweh is actually translated as the self-existent and the eternal, and Elohim actually means authority, authoritative power, or powerful authority. And so if the man is actually created in the image and likeness of Yahweh Elohim, then he's actually made in the image and likeness of the self-existent and the eternal authoritative power. In this case, those names in particular identifies how he functions. So he functions self-existently. He was created to function self-existently, and in that self-existent function is eternity, eternal life, which is where the whole idea of eternal life comes from, because the breath of life in the garden was the breath of Yahweh Elohim, and Yahweh Elohim is the eternal one. Therefore, his breath will be the breath of life, will be the breath of the eternal one.
So before you go on, you were actually talking about the name so I just want to elaborate on this a little bit so that those listening wouldn't be lost, because this might be a new idea, especially for those who are not familiar with the Hebrew system of thought. So name as identified in Western world, we have attributed, let's say, a pen, the name pen, so that we can identify it amongst other things on our desks.
Right.
So you're saying basically that pen is named a pen if it were named by someone who wrote the Bible, the authors who are familiar with the ancient Hebrew system of thought. The name pen would be related to the function. So it would be called a pen because it can write.
Because it just functions in a particular manner. In other words, the names in the ancient Hebrew perspective actually are titles. Just for example, another good example of that would be, you know, in a place of employment, in an office, you have a manager. There's a title.
Uh-huh.
That title comes with the comprehension of a particular function.
Oh, definitely.
It's understood that that function comes with the name, with the term manager. With an accountant, it is understood that there is a function that comes with that. With the title supervisor, it's a function. Employee, function. Landlord, all of those. These are titles that actually are attributed. That it also determines and gives an understanding of the essence and function of the person that actually falls in, of the person that is attributed that title.
Okay, got what you're saying. So when you said that the man, because it's very common for people to think that when God made man, that He simply just made him as a human being to exist on the earth, and so because of that understanding, it I think it will be worth elaborating on this part in particular so that our listeners can identify, separated from the westernized perspective, that when God breathed into man, when He made man in the image and likeness of God, based on what you're saying, He breathed into him a function, similarly to how a doctor functions in a particular capacity, and
Right.
an accountant and so on.
Right. So that same breath in particular, the breath of life, being the image and likeness of Yahweh Elohim, means that He takes on the function also of Yahweh Elohim. And if God is self-existent and functions self-existently, then the Adam in the garden was created to function self-existently, which
Ah,
is where his eternity comes from.
okay, so his
Just as,
function.
just as God is also the authoritative power, then he's designed to function via the perspective of authority.
Okay, gotcha. So simply put, God breathed into the man, the Adam, and He breathed into him the function which made the man function in God on the earth.
Yes.
Boom. All right.
So when this took place with this function, what really took place is that through the deception that took place in the garden, man was actually deceived to change or to add a function that was not within the function that he was attributed. So through the deception, man actually began to self-existently, before I say that, self-existently, from the perspective of self-existence, everything that you generally need is actually breathed into you. And therefore, to live self-existently would be first to identify what has been breathed into you, and to act inspired by what has been breathed into you, which simply means that you're not using any external influencing factors. You are self-determining, self-generating.
Gotcha.
Now, this is actually, by the way, in the New Testament, it is reflected by the Holy Spirit in your heart. You're actually living from the inside out. Now, in the garden, in particular, through the deception that took place in the garden, the Adam was actually tricked. Well, he was actually, and they were tricked to pursue life externally, to pursue what was already internal, to pursue it externally. And so, man, in particular, from eating from the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which in modern day English can also be stated the tree of the knowledge of what is functional, the tree of your subjective knowledge, of your own knowledge of what is functional and dysfunctional. What he literally did was begin to function contrary to the function that was attributed to him, which was using external points of comparison. Now, the words image and likeness can be said in our modern day English as mental image and point of comparison. So if you're in the image and likeness of God, you actually need mental image and you're using God as your point of comparison to be able to determine who you are, what your potential is, and how you actually pretty much how you function. your
Right.
perspective, your frame of reference.
So,
When Adam made his decision in the garden, he changed his function and he began to function um, from an external point of comparison. And in this case, from eating when he ate of the tree when he ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what he literally did was began to use the tree as his new point of comparison. Now, according to the ancient Hebrews, he used the tree as his point of comparison and began to use it as a point of reference to be able to determine what he was, what his potential was, and what his potential limitations were. This is why you'll notice that he actually ate of the tree and he found himself naked and he clothed himself with leaves. What really took place was that he used the tree as a point of comparison and using the tree as a point of comparison, he reckoned within himself that the tree was clothed with leaves. And if he's using the tree as the point of comparison, then he's actually being the image and likeness of the tree. The tree is clothed with leaves, then he was naked. And so he began to clothe himself with leaves. Shortly after that, go ahead.
So I just want to address back, 'cause you said something a few minutes ago that actually I think again is something worthy of just pondering on for a moment there. You said that when the Adam basically was made, I'm just paraphrasing, was made to function as God in the garden, as Yahweh Elohim. So that was the name of the breath, which is now like his title. What he did, based on what you shared, was that he decided to compare himself with something outside of his spirit.
Outside of himself.
Right, which means that instead of functioning as God, he decided to function as what in particular?
Whatever he's using as his point of comparison.
Okay, so in the garden, what did he use? Did he use
the tree?
All right.
Literally, it sounds hilarious, but it was actually the tree, and you see that he actually dressed himself up like a tree, dressed himself up with leaves, and then he ran and he hid among other trees. We, in our modern day English, in our modern day culture, we call that finding your tribe.
Right. Okay, that's a term that's definitely relatable. Because I mean, I guess the Bible was written at a time where the nature and the particular society that they existed in, it was common to use trees and all this agriculture and stuff like that as something that people could relate to. In our Western world, I guess we're so busy with what we're doing that nobody really pays attention to trees and stuff like that. So it really does sound a bit hilarious.
And it's very important that people actually understand that he didn't hide behind the tree; he hid among trees.
Okay.
Finding his tribe. He's actually using, of course, which is the common reaction. So whatever you're using as a point of comparison, you begin to dress yourself with your point of comparison, and then you find those who are using the same point of comparison.
It's so true. It's so true. So, going back a moment to what you mentioned concerning the Adam. So he basically compared himself to a tree, which is absolutely crazy that you would give up your God function to relate to a tree, give up the capacity of God. And in doing that, you said he dressed himself with leaves, which I think is something also weird. And you mentioned that just now that that's what people do in our modern day. That would be dressing yourself with whatever the tribe that you are relating to dress themselves with, metaphorically speaking, of course. And from there, I just wanted to dress back on the function in particular. It meant that once he did that, he gave up I would use in biblical terms, the spirit, and now pretty much lost it all and was now powerless.
Well, I want to say, actually, to be more specific, I'd say what he did was abandon his spirit, his own spirit, his spirit within, and began to compare himself with things external of himself, using those external points of comparison. And listen up, this is where it gets very serious here. Is that what he abandoned that and actually used the external point of comparison as his point of personal approval or personal validation, self-validation or self-approval.
Wow. all of that taking place right in the book of Genesis.
Yes, ma'am.
it's, so, it's so common for us to relate Genesis to the creation of the cosmos. This is really good.
Now, this what he did was actually included a function that was he actually included he being the first man was pretty much like the leader of the entire species, and so whatever he did was pretty much incorporated in and into himself, which caused corruption of his nature, and all of his descendants inherited this.
Okay, so all his children after that pretty much were
Everybody,
duplicates.
everybody inherited that.
Gotcha.
And so no, you actually asked me about the what really took place in the garden, and it will be unfair for me to actually not take that right back to Yeshua or Jesus, because that was actually the Adamic conundrum, was the abandonment of his self-existent function for what we at the International Institute of Pneumatology call identity codependency.
Okay.
Right? He was actually creating a self-existent identity, and he abandoned that for identity codependency, which is the conundrum of men throughout all of his lineage. Now, when you look at the scriptures in particular, what you really see in the Bible is that you see there is a flow of how men, in particular, all of his descendants, pretty much repeated the same thing that he did. And so you notice that in the scriptures, you see people actually using myriads of external reference points and being the image and likeness, or actually finding their own image and likeness, so to speak. Because when Adam actually made his decision, the scriptures actually says that he reproduced in his own image and likeness, whichever point of comparison he used. And throughout the scriptures and even throughout history, you see people doing the same thing. They inherited the same function, which is using money as a point of comparison to actually for personal validation, using wealth, using women, using possessions, using social status, using fame. All of these things are just an abundance and myriads of options for identity codependency.
It's so true.
And what simply takes place there in particular is in this identity codependency is that whatever they use for this personal approval or self-validation, what they're literally doing is using that to define themselves, to define who they are, to define what they are, to define their potential, and also to determine their limitations.
Right.
This is the whole Adamic conundrum.
It's so true. Because what you're saying there, we see it in society where a lot of people don't feel fulfilled. The identity codependency, you just mentioned that, we see that in society where a lot of people don't feel fulfilled till they have acquired certain possessions, as you were identifying just now. In wealth, whether they don't feel fulfilled if they're not married, or if
it is basically what they use as their priority.
Exactly.
And the source of inspiration. Now, the entire scriptures, I just want to actually say before we move on to anything else, is that the entire scriptures, the entire panorama of the scriptures demonstrates how all men in particular followed after the nature that they inherited from the first Adam, from his decision. And amongst these men, you had priests and prophets that would actually take on the identity of Yahweh. In essence, what you were looking at were men. These were the men that were actually set apart to take on the original identity. So that the priests and the prophets, when they began to function, they take on the name of Yahweh. This is why they would say, like, thus says Yahweh and I am Yahweh. They take on the name, which actually means that they're actually taking on the original identity and actually functioning as the pre-fallen Adam. Now, all this leads to Yeshua, which, by the way, is the breath of life, or God's breath, God's word, breathed into dust again. And so what you see in the biblical panorama is that after men spent thousands of years struggling with their own nature, God breathes life, breathes the breath of breathes his spirit, his breath. Spirit, breath is the same thing, into dust, which is in particular what we'll be speaking about, who the person who is referred to as the Virgin Mary here. Because in the Genesis narrative, Genesis chapter 3, when man made the decision, God said that dust you want, to dust you shall return.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're literally looking at there is God breathing his thought about himself back into dust again. And this is Jesus. And you see this in Jesus where, for example, you see Jesus actually begins to function. And Jesus in time ministry is speaking about authority. Why? Because Elohim is function.
Right.
Elohim equals authoritative power. And so you see that he is functioning in the name of his father, Yahweh Elohim. And I'm saying all of that to actually say that with the Adamic conundrum, Jesus is the one that actually came to actually restore all of that. And so when we, in particular, we are told to believe in our heart and confess with our mouth, that is our first act of self-existent function again.
So believing with our heart and confessing with our mouth is not something abstract based on what you're saying, but actually something concrete, functional.
It's very functional. Yeah.
It means that just as we, for example, take a new job. I mean, when we go to a new place for employment, we get that job. We take on a particular function.
Yeah.
You're equating that to believing in your heart and confessing with your mouth, as in going forth and doing what your job description says.
Right. So when actually Jesus did what he did and he restored humanity, what Jesus did was, now, just to be clear, what you notice in the scriptures is that Jesus, who is the Word made flesh again, he actually took the identity of the fallen man and nailed it back to the tree. Man got the identity from the tree, and Jesus nailed the identity back to the tree. Mm-hmm. And restored the spirit of humanity. And so now what literally took place is that he sent out his apostles, or his disciples, who became apostles, to inform everyone of what has taken place. And so your first act of self-existence is believing in your heart and confessing in your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord, but more importantly, that Jesus Christ is your new breath. And your next step is to renew your mind, which simply means change your logic from identity codependency and come back to your original intention, which is identity, self-existent identity, functioning from the spirit in your heart and abandoning external influences.
Right. I mean, yeah, it does. It makes sense, and it sounds so simple the way you put it. It sounds like this crisis that because we started off talking about identity crisis, and then you pretty much phrased it as in the terms according to pneumatology as identity codependency.
Identity codependency.
And what you're saying is that the solution for the identity codependency is a lot easier than people think it is. Where I mean, people who are dealing with identity crisis, because you identify that this was something that originated from the Adam and it multiplied on, and a lot of people are probably living in the same mindset, even though they have the Spirit of God in them.
And because of that, they're not seeing any dramatic changes or any dramatic manifestation of what the scripture promises, because you cannot change what you have not identified.
Exactly. So what they're experiencing pretty much, because this is huge, right? Because we're dealing with millions of people who have been affected by this pandemic, and it has affected not only those who have been victims to the sickness itself or to the illness, but also family and loved ones. And a lot of people are in a limbo
Mm-hmm.
They're questioning who they are, who they really are. Right now, the
Yes.
persons who are feeling a sense of significance, and a massive shout outs to them because they're doing a really good job, are like the healthcare workers, because
Right.
they have found a place where they are needed. But
Frontline workers. Yeah.
outside of that, and they're really doing an excellent job, and outside of that, there are people who are still feeling that void, cut that gap, because what the life as they knew has been overturned. And so now there's a lot of conflicts, relationship conflicts, causing this, jobs. And so you're saying that identity codependency is pretty much the problem that's on the table,
That is exactly what I'm saying.
and the solution.
Everything in particular that you see in the world right now, as you have just listed,
Hmm.
actually actually identifies the identity codependency. And here's how. And this is actually why the sons of God are here, to actually make the announcement that Jesus actually restored the breath of life into all humanity, and to get back to self-existent function.
Hmm.
And here's how we see the presence of identity codependency. We live in a world that is actually taught. Now, when Adam made his decision to. Now, this in particular is not very commonly taught, but and not very commonly known. But when the Adam was created in the garden, when God breathed Himself into dust, the Adam actually had the option. He had actually one of two options: to build a civilization on the earth, which is why
Hmm.
he was told to go forth, to build a civilization on the earth based on the principle of the tree of life, or to build a civilization based on his own knowledge of what is functional and dysfunctional. And so, all throughout history, and even in the presence of our modern day society, where there is the presence of this pandemic and these global crises, what you see reveals identity codependency. And here's how. The society has actually taught us, has taught that you should actually use things like money to determine who you are, what your potential, what your potential is, and what your limitations are. To use your profession, to use a job, to depend on the job. Now, all of these things, to use social status, to use fame,
Relationship status.
relationship status, whether you're married or you're not married, whether you have a good job or you don't have a good actually to have a good job, to use that as when it, and you hear it in different ways. For example, it is taught, to be a man, you need to have a good job. To be a woman, you need this. You're not considered a real woman if you're not married.
And if you have kids, come on.
All of these things are actually
Yeah.
factors that are taught to be used as points of personal validation and self-approval. When this pandemic took place, what you saw throughout the entire world was the dependence on employment. Now, I'm not saying that employment is bad. It is in no way bad. It fulfills a function, but it actually reveals the codependency on these things around, instead of actually and not self-existent identity. Now, how this is present is very simple. When you actually using an external point of comparison, when you are actually getting what you have established as your point of comparison, in the presence of your point of comparison, or whatever you're using as your personal validation, you feel strong.
Yeah.
Remove it, and you step into anxiety.
Yeah, I can.
You step into fear. You step into feelings of inadequacy. You step into depression.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Because for me in particular, because I came out, and I'll share a personal testimony of myself here for those listening.
Mhm.
So I had to make a decision a few years back to actually stay at home to take care of my kids, right? And when I made that decision, there was a lot of I stepped into anxiety at a particular point in time, because little did I know that at that point in time I was actually using that to
Right.
determine my worth and my value.
Yeah.
So the particular organization I was working for had a reputation and a status of a good one, not a bad one.
Mm-hmm.
And Leaving that to stay at home, I felt so incompetent. I felt like eventually, when the truth of what I did had actually hit me, I felt like a less of a person in society.
Right.
And it took me years to overcome it. The anxiety kick in, depression. I started to feel like, I lost my importance in the society because
Yeah.
here I am home with my kids doing,
Mm.
motherly stuff. And, my friends and so on are actually there making that money, buying new stuff, going out, hanging out. And so my life had flipped upside down. And I'm
Right.
sure many women out there can listen because this is something that a lot of families are forced to make that decision, especially because of the pandemic as well, to make that choice to do what's best for your family, whatever best is.
Right.
And so I felt really, really horrible. And I wish I had known this before. It would have saved me years of depression and feeling like less of a person. I literally went into a hole, like a lot of people do. I went like underground for some time. I didn't want to talk to people because, the first thing when you greet other people, the first thing they'll start asking you about is like job related stuff. How you
Right.
doing? They ask about the
Right.
kids, and that's fine. But then when they start to get into that topic, I felt like, okay, let's not go there because I wasn't doing what the society had decided or determined
Right.
successful was.
Yeah. And
So,
that. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
so for those who are listening, I just in that particular who fit that particular category, I just based on what we have shared here, this is just a word of truth and encouragement of the truth that these things are excellent. The job and the status and so on, they're great, and I salute that. However, as Ian said a while ago, it has a function, and you also have a function. And part of your function is not to compare yourself with people around you, things around you, and people who may seem that they are successful. I mean, I applaud and admire successful people according to what the society has deemed successful. At the same time, according to what we have, the rediscovered truth found in the Bible, your potential is far greater than these things, and it's not limited to that.
Yeah. So, this in particular, for those, what we're speaking about here, and what the presence of what we saw in the world, particular, all of these things that actually reveal the identity codependency. All of this has been in the scriptures. It has been in the scriptures all along. It's just it's actually the scriptures have not been viewed through the lens of what really took place in the Garden of Eden and how Jesus is the correction of that.
Mhm.
And so when Jesus came, or the presence of Jesus, or Jesus, the purpose of Jesus is really to actually have restored humanity. And this is why, as I mentioned earlier on, this is why Jesus, particularly Jesus nailing the identity back to the cross and restoring, basically, literally restoring humanity, our purpose and message as sons of God, is actually show everyone that Jesus has already fixed this.
Mhm.
Now the message is to reorientate your identity codependency, because you're not designed to function like that, but to function from self-existence, in identity, self-existent identity.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in all of the world that we actually living in here today, this is actually needed. It's very pressing. It's all around us. Mental health issues, emotional health issues, all of these things actually come from the perspective or the mindset or the logic of identity codependency. And the self-existent identity in particular is the solution to all of this. When you step into self-existent identity, you no longer use external things as points of comparison. How is this simply approached? According to the scriptures and according to what's mentioned in Genesis narrative, particularly in Genesis narrative, what we see, what we see in particular is, to actually reorientate that simply means that you need to now identify yourself by the original identity, because through identity codependency, you literally choose what you identify yourself with. And that breath that you're breathing is also in the Bible is actually spirit. And that spirit, to actually understand that spirit, you really need to be able to understand what has been breathed into you to begin to function from what has been breathed into you from the inside out, instead of actually functioning from the outside in, as in allowing, which by the way is why the Holy Spirit is given to us and given to all sons and all to all sons of God eternally. He will never be absent. There's the reason why he's actually promised and promised eternally is simply that he is the one in particular that actually determines your identity, your potential, and your function. And if he is present eternally, then there will be never a time that you will need to step into anxiety, fear, depression, feelings of inadequacy. These things will no longer exist from a self-existent identity.
So I have a question I'm putting out here for you, for our listeners who may be experiencing the identity crisis that we're talking about here. I mean, you share quite a lot that has been so helpful, and I know people are really blessed by this. Now, let's take this and show how to practically apply it to life. So, let's say, because I have been doing some research in the area, and mental health in particular is really, really something that needs to be addressed. When I say mental health, I mean people are feeling unfulfilled because they feel like they have no purpose. And of course, that leads to the identity crisis. What then would you define as having a fulfilling life? Now that we understand living from the breath is what really matters, living from your function, what would you say then defines having a fulfilling life for someone who wants to step into this or understand how do they really experience this? What would you recommend? What approach would you take to help them experience it?
Well, firstly, just yesterday I was actually having a conversation on this. The first thing that you need to do is to redefine how you're using the Bible.
Okay.
Because in the westernized world, the Bible is actually treated as something as like rules and regulations, and all of these things are perspectives that are really independent of the actual thought heritage of the authors of the text. The Bible is actually is the Bible in of itself is the story of how God made man and made man to function self-existently, and everything that the man needed was actually breathed into him. And man made a decision that caused him to fall below his intended function and potential. And while the promise of the Messiah was present, God put in place a mechanism, which is what we know as the law code of Moses, the law of Moses, or the Mosaic law. God put in place a mechanism, like a control mechanism, to keep them until the Messiah comes. And when the Messiah came, the Messiah nailed that fallen identity. I'm going to put that in quote unquote fallen identity back to the tree, which is what the cross is. He nailed it back to the tree and restored humanity with the breath of life. Therefore, when we look at the scriptures, we are not looking at the scriptures for rules and regulations. We look into the scriptures to actually see everything that God has said, all the promises of God in the scriptures, to really understand what has been breathed into you. Every promise that was spoken by Yahweh is coming from the nature of God and from the function of God. Therefore, all of that has been breathed into you. So number one, you need to actually redefine, as I explained there just now, how you're using the Bible to be able to actually identify what you are, who you are, and how you function, and actually understand what has been breathed into you. Every single promise in the scriptures is actually what has been breathed into you. Secondly, you need to actually understand how to actually create a simple framework to be able to be inspired from what has been breathed into you. The same Spirit of God has been breathed into you, the Holy Spirit. What that how to actually literally put a framework in place to be able to walk from inspired by what has been breathed into you to be able to manifest heaven on earth.
Right. So these steps that you're identifying here, because I know for some persons hearing it, I mean, I can sense a lot of people are already getting excited about it because it feels like you're just one step away of finding your purpose and understanding how to live a fulfilling life.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I know people will not want to waste, at least people who are really serious, not want to waste one more day not experiencing. Is this something that you help people walk them through? Like if they want a sense of direction, something, a personalized plan or something to help make this happen?
This is exactly what we do at the International Institute of Dermatology. What we do is actually educate all interested on what spirit is, how spirit functions, because everything I just explained there are like very light versions of what we teach and what we train to bring people into actual manifestation, spiritual manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
We have been doing this within the last 3 years. We've been actually functioning in this, and I've been seeing consistent results with this. So at the institute, we educate you on what spirit is, how that functions, and how to function from the knowledge of that. We also reorientate your perspective of your scriptures, and of course, once that is reorientated, then we help you change your logic from the codependent logic, the codependent identity, the identity codependency logic, the identity codependent logic, to the self-existent logic. Yeah, and we also actually do coaching in particular for those who actually want to put it on to work it out in an expedited manner.
Mm-hmm.
We actually we actually offer coaching at the institute where we train persons both in group coaching and one-on-one coaching, where we train persons to actually we educate you, as I mentioned, on what you are, on who you are, how you function. We educate you on what you are, who you are, and how you function, and we provide you with a framework that we have been using over the last 3 to 4 years that has successfully walked persons or reoriented persons' perspective and bring them into actual manifestation. Not only with regards to supernatural manifestation, but also applying that to marriage, to relationship. We do it with regards to business. What is the self-existent logic in business, in marriage? As I mentioned, there's not in relationship, in your spiritual life.
Parenting.
Parenting. We also train children through the self-existent logic and their experience, and they are actually manifesting the same things, the same supernatural manifestation. We have children that actually walk and lay hands and heal effortlessly. See manifestation like that. Yeah, so all of this is actually available at the institute.
Awesome. So if anyone is interested, feel free to check us out. We will be sure to get back to you. As Zane mentioned, the coaching and so on in particular, if this is something that you're serious about and you want to start experiencing or shifting from depression, feeling hopelessness, worthlessness, if you have lost interest in things you once enjoy and so life seems to be just dull, if it has physically affected you and you experience like irritability, lack of eagerness to interact with society and people, and it may have affected like even physically on your body through sickness, fatigue, loss of appetite and so on. All of those things are just some of the stuff that or some of the fruits of identity crisis and identity codependency, even in your work. So if this is something that you think that you want to address now, start on it today, you can check out www.patreon.com/sane, CANE_EL_FUEGO, Fuego.
Right? We hope that this actually stimulates your mindset with regards to changing your perspective of the Bible and changing the perspective of the scriptures, as the name of this this episode actually indicates. Rebooting biblical perspective. We hope that this encourages you to revisit your perspective of the Bible, to reboot that, and to view the scriptures and understand and know that the scriptures are still applicable. Today, it will be applicable for, I think, it will be applicable as long as there's codependent identity on the earth. It will be applicable to actually function as the user's manual of your breath. I want to say that again. It functions as the user's manual of your breath. All right, so this is Rebooting Biblical Perspective. We would like to give a huge shout out to Kingdom Purpose TV and Radio, where we are actually airing live presently. You can actually visit them online. You can also check them out on Facebook. We are Zane and Fuego, the Christ Hematologist, and
I am Lady Keturah, your Christ mentor.
You can also visit us at www.internationalinstituteofpneumatology.com. This is Rebooting Biblical Perspective, the one and most unique podcast where we approach the New Testament, identifying and the Bible in general, identifying the misguided perspectives and giving context to the rediscovered spiritual dynamics and physics of the scriptures via the lens of Yeshua as a rabbi and his apostles. Today we spoke about identity crises. Stay tuned. We'll see you next Wednesday, same time, 5 p.m. EST. Boom.